Number 10. The Clovis culture. Long before the rise of cities, temples, or written history in the Americas, there were people whose presence stretched across vast distances and whose disappearance remains one of the oldest mysteries on the continent. Today, they are known as the Clovis culture, named after the distinctive stone tools first discovered near Clovis, New Mexico. For a long time, they were considered the earliest known widespread culture in North America, and even now they remain one of the most enigmatic. What made the Clovis people remarkable was not only their antiquity, but their reach. Their finely crafted spear points have been found across enormous areas, suggesting a culture capable of moving, adapting, and surviving across radically different landscapes. These were not isolated bands leaving behind random traces. They were part of a recognizable tradition, one that spread with striking speed and left a signature clear enough for archaeologists to identify thousands of years later. And then, almost as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. The distinctive Clovis toolkit faded from the archaeological record, replaced by other cultures and other technologies. Why that happened is still debated. Some researchers connect their disappearance to the extinction of large Ice Age animals they may have hunted. Others point to climate shifts at the end of the last Ice Age, when changing environments may have transformed life too quickly for old ways to survive. There are even broader theories involving sudden ecological disruption and the collapse of an entire lifeway built around a world that no longer existed. That is what makes the Clovis culture such a haunting beginning to this list. It reminds us that civilizations and cultures do not always vanish in the way we imagine. Sometimes they leave no grand ruins, no written farewell, no final battle carved in stone. Sometimes all that survives are fragments of worked stone buried in ancient ground, whispering that a people once spread across a continent and then slipped beyond the reach of memory. Number 9. The Nabateans. In the deserts of Arabia and the southern Levant, a civilization once rose that mastered trade, water, and stone with astonishing skill. The Nabateans built a wealthy and sophisticated society in one of the harshest regions on Earth, turning barren landscapes into crossroads of commerce and culture. Their most famous legacy is Petra, the city carved into rose-red rock, but Petra was only the visible face of a much larger world. The Nabateans controlled major trade routes that carried incense, spices, and luxury goods across the ancient world. They developed systems to capture and manage water so effective that they could support urban life in terrain where survival itself was a challenge. Their cities were not accidental outposts. They were carefully planned centers of wealth, diplomacy, and adaptation, shaped by people who understood the desert not as an obstacle, but as an advantage. And yet, despite their success, the Nabateans eventually faded as a distinct civilization. After the Roman annexation of their kingdom in the 2nd century AD, their political independence disappeared, and over time their language, identity, and dominance gradually dissolved into larger imperial systems. That kind of disappearance is often quieter than conquest in popular imagination, but no less profound. A people who once commanded routes across the desert slowly became shadows inside the history of others. What makes their story so compelling is the contrast between what they achieved and how little of their living identity remains. Petra still astonishes the world, its facades glowing from the canyon walls as if the city has only just been abandoned. But the civilization that built it no longer speaks for itself. Its monuments survive, its genius survives. Yet the people behind that world seem to have retreated into silence, leaving us with one of the clearest examples of how a civilization can shape history, then vanish so completely that its greatest city becomes a mystery before it becomes a memory. Number 8. The Olmecs. Long before the rise of the Aztecs and the Maya at their height, another civilization emerged in Mesoamerica and helped shape much of what came after. Today we call them the Olmecs, and although their name survives, much of their world does not. They flourished in the tropical lowlands of what is now southern Mexico, building ceremonial centers, shaping early religious traditions and leaving behind some of the most unforgettable monuments in the ancient world. The most famous of these are the colossal stone heads, immense carved faces weighing many tons, each with distinct features and a presence so powerful that they still feel almost alive. These monuments alone are enough to make the Olmecs extraordinary. They reveal artistic skill, political authority, and the ability to move massive stones across difficult terrain in an age with no modern machinery. But the deeper mystery lies not just in what they built, but in how much influence they may have had. Many historians see the Olmecs as one of the foundational civilizations of Mesoamerica, a culture whose ideas about kingship, ritual, symbolism, and sacred space may have echoed through later societies for centuries. And yet, for all their importance, the Olmecs did not endure as a visible dominant civilization. Their great centers, such as San Lorenzo and La Venta, declined and were eventually abandoned. The reasons are still debated. Environmental change, shifting rivers, political upheaval, internal conflict, or the collapse of regional systems may all have played a role. But whatever happened, it was enough to erase the Olmecs as a living power while leaving behind only fragments of their legacy. That is what makes them so haunting. The Olmecs seem less like a civilization fully preserved in history and more like the deep-buried roots of a world that came later. Their monuments remain, heavy and silent, but the people themselves are gone, their language uncertain, their beliefs only partly understood, and their disappearance still wrapped in shadow. They helped shape a civilization zone that would later produce some of the greatest cultures in the ancient Americas, yet they themselves slipped away so early and so completely that they now feel like the first lost echo of a much larger story. Number 7. The Minoans, on the island of Crete, surrounded by the waters of the Mediterranean, a civilization once flourished with a level of beauty, complexity, and maritime power that made it one of the great wonders of the ancient world. The Minoans built elaborate palaces, painted vivid frescoes, developed far-reaching trade networks, and created a culture that still feels strikingly sophisticated. At places like Knossos, their world appears in glimpses of color, ceremony, and architectural ambition, as though an entire civilization had once lived in motion and light. For a long time, the Minoans seemed almost legendary, partly because so much about them remained unclear. Their writing system, known as Linear A, has never been fully deciphered, which means one of the most important voices in their civilization still cannot speak directly to us. We can see their art, their symbols, their palaces, and their influence, but their own language remains largely locked away. That silence adds a strange distance to everything they left behind. Their decline has fascinated historians for generations. Some point to the catastrophic volcanic eruption on Thera, modern Santorini, which may have triggered tsunamis, environmental damage, and regional instability severe enough to weaken the Minoan world. Others believe the final collapse came through a combination of disaster, invasion, and takeover by Mycenaean powers from mainland Greece. The evidence suggests not one simple ending, but a civilization battered by forces both natural and human until it could no longer remain what it had once been. That is why the Minoans remain so compelling. They did not disappear without leaving beauty behind. In some ways, they left too much beauty, enough to make their loss feel even more unsettling. Their art still glows. Their palaces still rise from the ground. Their seaborne world still seems tantalizingly close. And yet the people who built that civilization, who danced through those painted halls and wrote in a script we still cannot fully read, vanished into the currents of history, leaving behind one of the ancient world's most elegant and most mysterious disappearances. Number 6. The Kingdom of Aksum. In the highlands of East Africa, a powerful kingdom once rose that stood at the crossroads of Africa, Arabia, and the wider ancient world. This was the Kingdom of Aksum, a civilization centered in what is now northern Ethiopia and Eritrea, and for centuries it was one of the most important powers of its age. It controlled trade routes, minted its own coins, built monumental stone stelae, and connected distant regions through commerce, diplomacy, and belief. Yet despite all of that, Aksum eventually faded so far from global memory that many people today barely realize how influential it once was. At its height, Aksum was no isolated kingdom. It was a major center of exchange linking the Mediterranean world, the Red Sea, the Arabian Peninsula, and inland Africa. Its rulers projected power through architecture and religion, and its stone monuments remain among the most striking in the ancient world. Some of the giant stelae carved from single pieces of granite still stand as reminders of a civilization confident in its wealth, engineering, and identity. This was not a forgotten tribe on the edge of history. It was a serious kingdom operating at the heart of ancient networks. And yet something changed. Over time, shifts in trade, environmental pressure, political transformation, and changing regional power may all have contributed to Aksum's decline. As maritime routes evolved and new forces reshaped the region, the kingdom gradually lost the position that had once made it so important. Its political center weakened, its influence narrowed, and the civilization that had once stood among the great powers of its era slowly retreated from the world stage. That is what makes Aksum so haunting. It did not disappear because it left nothing behind. It disappeared because it left behind enough to prove how much was lost. Its monuments still rise from the earth, its coins still survive, its legacy still echoes through religion and regional history. But the civilization itself, as a dominant ancient power, slipped away so completely that for many outside its region, it became little more than a footnote. Aksum reminds us that even greatness can vanish not only through destruction, but through the slow and unsettling silence of being forgotten. Number 5. The ancestral Puebloans. In the canyonlands and deserts of the American Southwest, a civilization once built homes, ceremonial structures, and entire communities into the rock itself. Today, they are known as the ancestral Puebloans, and the remains they left behind are among the most extraordinary in North America. Cliff dwellings tucked into high stone alcoves, carefully planned settlements, roads, towers, and kivas still suggest a world of deep knowledge, adaptation, and spiritual meaning. Yet the people who created those places eventually left many of them behind, and the reasons remain one of the region's great historical mysteries. Sites like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon reveal a society capable of remarkable organization. These were not scattered shelters built in desperation. They were carefully designed communities that reflected long-term planning, social structure, and a sophisticated relationship with landscape and astronomy. The architecture itself carries a quiet intelligence, using stone, light, elevation, and natural protection in ways that still feel impressive even today. The deeper archaeologists look, the clearer it becomes that this was a civilization shaped by strategy, ritual, and environmental knowledge. But sometime in the late 13th century, many of the great centers were abandoned. Entire communities moved away, leaving behind dwellings that still seem ready to be re-entered. Scholars have proposed many explanations, including prolonged drought, resource stress, social unrest, conflict, and the strain of maintaining large interconnected systems in an unforgiving environment. Most likely, the disappearance was not caused by one single event, but by pressures that slowly made the old way of life impossible to sustain. What gives the ancestral Puebloans their particular power on this list is the feeling they leave behind. Their homes are still there, suspended in stone as if waiting for voices to return. Their roads still cut across the land. Their ceremonial spaces still hold a presence that modern visitors can feel even without fully understanding it. And that is the heart of the mystery. A civilization deeply rooted in place chose, or was forced, to leave some of its most extraordinary places behind. The walls remain, the silence remains, but the full story of why so many of those worlds were left empty is still carried away by the desert wind. Number 4. The Indus Valley Civilization. At its height, the Indus Valley civilization was one of the largest and most sophisticated societies in the ancient world. Stretching across parts of what are now Pakistan and northwestern India, it built major urban centers, organized trade networks, standardized construction, and developed systems of water management that still feel astonishingly advanced. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa reveal a civilization of order, planning, and technical intelligence, one that emerged alongside the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and yet remains far more mysterious in crucial ways. That mystery begins with silence. Unlike many other major ancient civilizations, the Indus Valley people left behind no fully deciphered writing that can clearly tell us who ruled them, how their society was structured, or what happened when their world began to change. Their seals, symbols, and inscriptions survive, but their meaning remains uncertain. We can walk through the patterns of their cities, trace the lines of their drains and walls, and admire the precision of their bricks, yet the voices of the people themselves remain locked behind a script we still do not understand. And then gradually the civilization declined. Its great cities were abandoned or transformed, its urban systems weakened, and the highly organized world it once sustained lost its coherence. Scholars have proposed many factors, including climate shifts, changes in river systems, economic disruption, ecological stress, and migration. The evidence suggests not a sudden disappearance in a single dramatic moment, but a slow unraveling of one of the ancient world's most impressive urban civilizations. That slow unraveling may be what makes the Indus Valley civilization so haunting. It was not destroyed in a final blaze that history recorded in detail. It simply receded, leaving behind planned cities, undeciphered signs, and the unsettling impression of a civilization too advanced to have become this silent. It reminds us that even the most organized societies can fade until their ruins remain clearer than their story, and their streets survive better than their names. Number 3. The Maya Collapse. For centuries, the Maya built one of the most remarkable civilizations in the ancient Americas. Across the forests and plains of Mesoamerica, they raised cities, temples, pyramids, observatories, and palaces, developing writing, astronomy, mathematics, and political systems of extraordinary sophistication. Their monuments recorded dynasties, wars, rituals, and cosmic meanings in stone. In many ways, the Maya did not leave behind mystery because they were obscure. They left behind mystery because they were so advanced, so visible, and yet so much of their world still broke apart. The great puzzle lies in what happened during the so-called Maya collapse, especially in the southern lowlands during the late Classic period. Over time, many once powerful city centers were abandoned. Monument building declined. Royal inscriptions ceased. Populations dropped, and places that had once stood at the center of a thriving civilization slowly fell silent beneath the jungle. It was not that the Maya people themselves vanished entirely, because Maya descendants still live today. The mystery is why so many of the great urban and political systems that once defined their world fragmented so dramatically. Historians and archaeologists have spent decades piecing together the answer. Environmental stress, severe drought, warfare, overpopulation, political instability, and resource depletion have all been proposed as major contributing factors. Most likely, the collapse came not from one single catastrophe, but from a chain of pressures that pushed an already complex system toward breakdown. That explanation is persuasive, yet the emotional impact of the collapse remains difficult to shake. A civilization that could chart the heavens and carve history into stone watched some of its greatest cities disappear into the forest. That is why the Maya remain one of history's most compelling examples of disappearance. Their knowledge did not simply vanish, and their people did not cease to exist. But the world they built, especially its monumental centers of power, fractured so deeply that later generations encountered many of them as ruins reclaimed by nature. The temples remained, the jungle remained, the descendants remained. But the shining network of cities that once defined Maya greatness became a ghost of itself, leaving behind one of the ancient world's most beautiful and most unsettling collapses. Number 2. The Cahokia civilization. Long before European cities rose across North America, a vast urban center flourished near the Mississippi River in what is now the American Midwest. Today it is known as Cahokia, and at its height it was one of the largest and most complex settlements north of Mexico. Earthen mounds rose above the landscape, plazas stretched across carefully organized space, and a dense population lived within a civilization that many people today still do not realize ever existed. That is part of what makes Cahokia so haunting. It was not a small village or a scattered tribal settlement. It was a major center of power, ceremony, and social organization, with monumental earthworks requiring extraordinary labor and coordination. The largest of these, Monk's Mound, still dominates the site, a reminder that this was a place built on ambition and authority. Cahokia stood as proof that sophisticated urban life in ancient North America took forms many later histories failed to fully acknowledge, and then it declined. By the centuries before European contact with the region, the great center had been largely abandoned. Why that happened remains one of the most debated questions in North American archaeology. Environmental stress, flooding, resource pressure, political instability, social unrest, and changing regional networks have all been suggested. As with many vanished civilizations, the answer was likely not one single event, but a series of pressures that slowly unraveled a fragile and highly organized world. What makes Cahokia feel especially unsettling is how completely it slipped from public memory. A civilization once capable of building immense ceremonial landscapes and sustaining large populations became so obscured that later generations often passed over its traces without grasping their meaning. The mounds remained, but the living system behind them was gone. And that is what places Cahokia so high on this list. It reminds us that an entire civilization can rise in plain sight, shape a continent in ways we barely understand, and then disappear so thoroughly that the silence it leaves behind becomes part of the mystery itself. Number 1. The Rapa Nui civilization. Few vanished. Civilizations leave behind an image as unforgettable as the people of Rapa Nui. On one of the most remote inhabited islands in the world, a society once carved and raised nearly 900 giant stone figures, known as moai, creating one of the most iconic cultural landscapes in human history. These monuments still stand across Easter Island, some upright, some fallen, some unfinished, as if the civilization that made them stepped away in the middle of an act the world still cannot fully comprehend. The power of Rapa Nui lies in the contrast between isolation and achievement. This was a society living far from major continents, with limited resources and an environment that demanded constant adaptation. Yet it produced colossal monuments, ceremonial platforms, and an artistic and spiritual legacy so distinctive that it became one of the ancient world's most recognizable mysteries. The moai were not random sculptures. They were expressions of identity, ancestry, and sacred authority tied to a civilization whose worldview survives only in fragments. The disappearance of that world has been debated for generations. Older explanations often framed the collapse as a cautionary tale of ecological destruction, suggesting that the island's people exhausted their own resources and brought about their downfall. More recent research has challenged the simplicity of that narrative, arguing for a more complex picture involving resilience, adaptation, outside contact, disease, enslavement, and colonial disruption. In other words, the story of Rapa Nui may not be one of a civilization suddenly destroying itself, but of a society transformed and devastated through a combination of internal strain and external forces. That complexity is exactly why Rapa Nui takes the number 1 place. It is not just a lost civilization. It is a lost civilization the modern world thought it understood too easily. The moai remain, silent and immense, but the society that gave them life was changed so deeply that much of its true history became blurred by myth, misinterpretation, and tragedy. Rapa Nui stands at the edge of the world like a warning from the past. Even the most extraordinary civilizations can become reduced to symbols, while the full truth of the people behind them slips almost out of reach.